Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The salt-stained planks of Tortuga's most notorious tavern groaned under the weight of desperate men and broken dreams. Captain Callum McCready sat hunched over a wooden table scarred by 1,000 knife fights, his weathered hands wrapped around an empty tankard that mocked him with its hollow echo. The rum was gone, his coin purse lighter than sea foam, and his crew's patience wearing thinner than his frayed coat sleeves. "Another round for the great Captain McCready," shouted Briggs, his first mate, voice dripping with sarcasm that cut through the tavern's smoky haze. The other pirates erupted in laughter, their gold teeth glinting in the candlelight like tiny suns in a night sky of missing molars and scurvy blackened gums. Callum's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. 3 months without a decent haul had reduced his once feared crew to harbor rats, picking through scraps and surviving on watered-down grog. The Crimson Serpent, his beloved ship, sat anchored in the harbor with sails patched so many times they resembled a beggar's quilt. Even the seagulls seemed to mock him, their cries echoing his failures across the Caribbean waters. The tavern door swung open with a bang that silenced even the drunkest sailor. Through the entrance stepped a man whose belly preceded him like the prow of a merchant vessel. His silk vest strained against his girth, and gold chains hung around his neck like anchors weighing down his considerable frame. Behind him shuffled a figure in a dark hooded cloak, face hidden in shadow. "Gentlemen," the fat man bellowed, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I am Cornelius Blackwood, and I come bearing an opportunity for any man brave enough to seize it." The tavern erupted in jeers and crude suggestions, but Blackwood raised a jeweled hand for silence. "My daughter requires a husband, and I require a man willing to wed her tonight. The reward?" He produced a barrel from seemingly nowhere, its wooden sides gleaming with promise. "A full barrel of the finest Caribbean rum, aged in Spanish oak and worth more than most of you scoundrels see in a year." Callum's eyes fixed on the barrel like a starving man spotting fresh bread. The rich, amber liquid sloshed invitingly within its confines, promising warmth for his empty belly and courage for his flagging spirit. Around him, his crew leaned forward with the desperate hunger of wolves circling wounded prey. "What's the catch, fat man?" called out One-Eyed Pete from across the room. "Your daughter got the pox? Missing limbs? Or is she just ugly enough to scare Blackbeard himself back from the grave?" Blackwood's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his small pig-like eyes. "My daughter is unique. She requires a husband who won't ask questions, won't pry into her affairs, and won't expect the usual marital privileges. A marriage in name only, you might say." The hooded figure beside him shifted slightly, and for a moment Callum caught a glimpse of pale, thick fingers clutching the cloak's edges. The woman was indeed large, her frame filling the dark fabric like a ship's sail billowing in a strong wind. "I'll do it," Callum heard himself saying, the words tumbling from his lips before his mind could catch them. The tavern fell silent, all eyes turning to the desperate captain. "I'll marry your daughter for that barrel." His crew stared at him with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. Briggs shook his grizzled head slowly, muttering something about captains who'd lost their way. But Callum's gaze remained fixed on the rum, imagining its burn sliding down his throat, washing away the taste of failure that had plagued him for months. Blackwood clapped his hands together with obvious delight. "Excellent. Father Murphy here can perform the ceremony immediately." He gestured to a thin, nervous-looking priest who had been sitting quietly in the corner, nursing what appeared to be his 10th mug of ale. The ceremony was a mockery of holy matrimony. Father Murphy slurred his way through the vows while the tavern patrons cheered and jeered in equal measure. Callum's bride never spoke, never lifted her hood, never even looked in his direction. When asked to confirm her consent, she merely nodded once, the movement barely visible in the candlelight. "You may kiss the bride," Father Murphy announced with a hiccup. Callum stepped forward, but the woman recoiled, pulling her hood lower over her face. Blackwood quickly intervened with a hearty laugh. "Perhaps later when they're better acquainted. Now, Captain McCready, your payment." The barrel was his, solid and real and wonderful. Callum's crew gathered around it like devotees before an altar, their eyes shining with anticipation. As the first drops of rum touched his lips, Callum felt the familiar fire spread through his chest, warming him from the inside out. For a moment, the world seemed brighter, full of possibility once again. But when he looked up from his drink, his new wife was gone. Blackwood too had vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and something else. Something that reminded Callum of low tide and rotting kelp. "Where did they go?" he asked the tavern keeper, a one-armed man named Sullivan who'd seen more secrets than a confessional booth. Sullivan's face paled in the lamplight. "Down to the old dungeons beneath the inn, Captain. That's where the Blackwood woman always goes when the moon rises full." He crossed himself with his remaining hand. "Been happening for 3 generations now. The women of that family, they ain't quite right if you catch my meaning." As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted up from somewhere deep below their feet, a low mournful cry that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. The tavern patrons fell silent, their faces reflecting a fear older than any treasure map or pirate's curse. Callum set down his tankard, the rum suddenly tasting like ash in his mouth. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Caribbean waters, and somewhere in the darkness below, his new wife wept with a voice that sounded barely human. The rum had lost its warmth by the time Callum decided to investigate the sounds emanating from beneath the Salty Anchor Inn. His crew had long since stumbled back to their hammocks aboard the Crimson Serpent, leaving him alone with nothing but the echo of his bride's haunting cries and the weight of his foolish decision, pressing down on his shoulders like a dead man's chest. Sullivan, the one-armed tavern keeper, had barricaded himself behind the bar, muttering prayers in a language that sounded older than Spanish or English. The other patrons had fled into the storm-lashed night, leaving Callum alone with the guttering candles and the persistent sound of weeping that seemed to seep through the very floorboards. "Where's the entrance to these dungeons?" Callum demanded, his hand instinctively moving to the cutlass at his hip. The familiar weight of the blade offered little comfort against whatever supernatural forces he was about to face. Sullivan pointed with a trembling finger toward a narrow wooden door, hidden behind a stack of empty barrels. "Down those stairs, Captain. But I'm warning you, no good has ever come from disturbing the Blackwood women during their episodes." The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. Stone steps descended into blackness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from Callum's lantern before it could penetrate more than a few feet. The air grew thick and heavy as he descended, carrying scents of brine, mildew, and something else, something organic and unsettling that made his stomach churn. The dungeons were older than the inn above, carved from living rock that wept moisture in the Caribbean humidity. Iron rings hung from the walls, their chains long since rusted away, speaking of darker times when this place had housed prisoners rather than whatever now occupied its depths. Callum's footsteps echoed hollowly as he followed the sound of crying deeper into the labyrinthine passages. He found her in a circular chamber at the heart of the dungeon complex. Beatrice, for that was the name Father Murphy had used during their mockery of a wedding, sat huddled against the far wall, her massive frame shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. The hood of her cloak had fallen back, revealing a face that would have been beautiful if not for the terror etched into every feature. Her hair was the color of spun gold, cascading in waves around shoulders broader than most men's. Her skin was pale as moonlight on calm seas, unmarked by the sun's harsh Caribbean kiss. But her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries rather than years, and when they fixed on Callum, he felt as though he was staring into the abyss itself. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't place, something that might have been Spanish mixed with sounds that seemed to predate human speech entirely. "The curse. It's stronger when there are witnesses." Callum approached slowly, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the wet stone walls. "What curse? What's happening to you?" Beatrice laughed, but the sound held no humor, only the bitter edge of someone who had accepted a fate too terrible to contemplate. "My great-grandmother was Isabella Blackwood, mistress to Don Carlos Monteverde, the Spanish governor's son. When he grew tired of her, she stole his greatest treasure, not gold or silver, but something far more precious. A relic blessed by the priests of Cibola, said to grant its owner dominion over the waters themselves." As she spoke, her form began to change. The soft curves of her human shape seemed to flow like water, her skin taking on a texture that reminded Callum of scales caught in moonlight. Her hands, which had appeared so delicate moments before, now ended in claws that scraped against the stone floor. The treasure was cursed, Beatrice continued, her voice becoming deeper, more resonant. Any woman of Blackwood blood who possesses it is transformed with each full moon, becoming something between human and sea creature. My great-grandmother passed it to my grandmother, who passed it to my mother, who died trying to break the curse. Now it falls to me. Callum's mind reeled as he tried to process what he was witnessing. Pirates dealt in curses and supernatural forces as commonly as they dealt in gold and rum, but seeing the transformation with his own eyes was something else entirely. Where is this treasure now? Beatrice's changing features twisted into something that might have been a smile. Hidden where only a Blackwood woman can reach it in the underwater caves beneath Devil's Triangle. But retrieving it requires more than courage. It requires someone willing to descend into the depths and face the guardians that Don Carlos placed there to protect his stolen prize. The transformation was accelerating now. Beatrice's legs had fused into something resembling a powerful tail, covered in scales that shimmered with an otherworldly light. Her breathing had changed too, becoming slower and deeper, as though she was adapting to an aquatic environment. "Why tell me this?" Callum asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Because the curse can be broken," she gasped, her human voice fighting against vocal cords that were no longer entirely human, but only by someone who married into the bloodline willingly, without knowing the truth, someone who chooses to help not for gold or glory, but because, she struggled to find the words, because they see something worth saving in a monster. Callum stared at this creature who had been his bride for less than 6 hours, weighing his options. He could walk away, pretend this night had never happened, and return to his life of small-time piracy and gradual decline. The marriage could be annulled. The rum was already his, and he owed this woman nothing. But something in her eyes, still recognizably human despite everything else that had changed, spoke to him of loneliness deeper than any ocean trench. Here was someone who had never chosen her fate, never asked for the burden she carried, yet bore it with a dignity that shamed his own self-pity. "These underwater caves," he said finally. "How deep are they?" Hope flickered in Beatrice's transforming features like a candle flame in a storm. Deep enough that no ordinary man could reach them, but with the right preparation, the right equipment. She paused, studying his face intently. "You're actually considering this madness." Callum nodded slowly, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I've spent my life searching for treasure. Maybe it's time I tried saving someone instead." Thunder crashed overhead, shaking dust from the ancient stones. In the distance, Callum could hear the storm growing stronger, as though the very elements were responding to the supernatural forces at work in the depths below Tortuga. Dawn broke over Tortuga like a cutlass slash across the sky, painting the Caribbean waters in shades of blood and gold. Callum had spent the remainder of the night in the dungeons with Beatrice, watching her complete transformation and listening to stories that would have sounded like madness from anyone else's lips. By sunrise, she had returned to her human form, though exhaustion clung to her like barnacles on a ship's hull. The crew of the Crimson Serpent gathered around their captain as he outlined his plan, their faces reflecting varying degrees of disbelief and concern. Briggs, his weathered first mate, spat into the harbor waters with obvious disgust. "Captain, with all due respect, you've lost your bloody mind," Briggs declared, his Scottish accent thickening with emotion. "Diving into cursed waters to retrieve some Spanish relic? We're pirates, not treasure hunters for supernatural nonsense." "Aye," agreed Stumpy Joe, whose wooden leg tapped nervously against the deck. "And what makes you think this woman ain't just spinning tales to get us killed? Could be a trap set by the Spanish Navy or worse, the Inquisition." Callum understood their skepticism. In the harsh light of day, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the harbor, the previous night's events seemed like something from a fever dream. But he had seen Beatrice's transformation with his own eyes, had felt the otherworldly cold that emanated from her changed form, had witnessed the ancient sorrow that dwelled in her inhuman gaze. "The treasure she speaks of isn't just gold and jewels," Callum explained, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect across the Caribbean. "It's a relic of power, something that could give us dominion over these waters. Imagine never fearing Spanish galleons again, never worrying about storms or rival pirates. The seas themselves would obey our will." Young Tommy Brewster, barely 18 and still green around the gills, raised a trembling hand. "But Captain, what about the curse? What if we all get transformed into whatever she becomes?" Before Callum could answer, Beatrice herself appeared at the gangplank, her hooded cloak pulled low against the morning sun. The crew fell silent, studying this woman who had supposedly married their captain for a barrel of rum. In daylight, her imposing size was even more apparent, but there was a grace to her movements that spoke of hidden strength. "The curse affects only women of Blackwood blood," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the deck. "You have nothing to fear from the transformation itself, but the guardians that protect the treasure." She paused, letting the implications hang in the salt-laden air. "They show no such discrimination." Beatrice climbed aboard with surprising agility for someone of her size, and Callum noticed how the ship seemed to settle more deeply into the water, as though she carried weight beyond the merely physical. She approached the center of the crew, pulling back her hood to reveal her golden hair and pale features in full sunlight. "I know what you're thinking," she continued, meeting each man's gaze in turn. "Why should you risk your lives for a stranger's curse? What's in it for a crew of pirates who owe allegiance to nothing but profit and survival?" Briggs crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "Aye, that's exactly what we're thinking, lass. So enlighten us." Beatrice reached into her cloak and withdrew something that made every man on deck gasp. It was a piece of worked gold, no larger than a man's palm, but it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Intricate carvings covered its surface, symbols that hurt to look at directly, as though they existed in more dimensions than human eyes were meant to perceive. "This is a fragment of the larger relic," she explained, holding it carefully with cloth-wrapped fingers. "Even this small piece holds power. Watch." She held the fragment over the ship's water barrel, speaking words in a language that predated any European tongue. The water began to glow with the same ethereal light as the gold, and when Stumpy Joe dipped his finger into it and tasted the result, his eyes widened in amazement. It's fresh water," he stammered. "Pure as mountain spring, sweet as morning dew. How is that possible?" "The complete relic can do far more," Beatrice said, carefully wrapping the fragment again. "It can calm storms, summon favorable winds, reveal hidden passages through treacherous reefs. The Spanish called it La Corona del Océano, the crown of the ocean. Whoever possesses it becomes master of the Caribbean seas." The crew exchanged glances, and Callum could see greed beginning to overcome their fear. These were men who had spent their lives at the mercy of wind and weather, who had watched good ships and better men claimed by the capricious ocean. The promise of mastery over the very forces that threatened them daily was more tempting than any chest of gold. "What exactly would we need to do?" asked Black Pete, the ship's navigator, his scarred face creased with thought. Beatrice moved to the ship's rail, gazing out at the distant horizon where storm clouds gathered like an ominous prophecy. "The treasure lies in an underwater cavern system 30 miles northeast of here, in the waters sailors call Devil's Triangle. The caves are protected by creatures that were once human, Spanish soldiers transformed by Don Carlos's dark magic into aquatic guardians." She turned back to face the crew, her expression grave. "The entrance is 60 feet below the surface, accessible only during the lowest tides of the new moon. We would need diving equipment, harpoons blessed by a priest, and men brave enough to face horrors that would make Davy Jones himself turn pale." 60 feet? Tommy Brewster's voice cracked with fear. "That's deeper than any man can dive and live to tell about it." "Not true," interjected One-Eyed Pete, who had remained silent until now. "I knew a pearl diver in the South Pacific who could reach 80 feet with the right preparation. Of course, it killed him eventually, but he managed it a dozen times before his lungs gave out." Callum studied his crew's faces, reading the mixture of terror and avarice that warred in each man's expression. "I won't force any of you to come," he said finally. "This is dangerous beyond anything we've attempted before. Any man who wants to leave can take his share of our remaining supplies and find berth on another ship." To his surprise, not a single crew member moved toward the gangplank. Even young Tommy, despite his obvious terror, stood his ground with the stubborn courage that had made him a pirate in the first place. Briggs spoke for them all when he said, "We've followed you through Spanish cannon fire and hurricane winds, Captain. If you say this cursed treasure is worth the risk, then we'll follow you to the bottom of the ocean itself." The next several hours were spent in frantic preparation. Callum sent men into Tortuga to gather supplies, lengths of rope that could withstand saltwater pressure, iron weights to help them descend quickly, and most importantly, the services of Father Miguel, an elderly Spanish priest who had fled the Inquisition and now made his living blessing weapons and offering last rites to dying pirates. Father Miguel examined the gold fragment with obvious recognition and growing alarm. Dios mío, he whispered, crossing himself repeatedly. I know of this relic. It was stolen from the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela by conquistadors seeking to expand Spanish dominion over the New World. The church declared it cursed and ordered its destruction, but it vanished before the Inquisition could claim it. Can you bless our weapons against the Guardians? Callum asked urgently. The priest nodded reluctantly. I can perform the proper rituals, but understand, what you're attempting goes against the natural order. The Guardians were placed there to keep the relic from being used for evil purposes. How do I know your intentions are pure? Beatrice stepped forward, removing her hood completely and allowing the priest to see her face clearly. Because I am the one who bears the curse, Father. Every month I transform into something monstrous, something that belongs more to the sea than to the land. I seek only to break this curse and free my bloodline from its burden. Father Miguel studied her with eyes that had seen too much suffering in his long life. Finally he nodded. Very well. I will bless your weapons and offer prayers for your souls. But I warn you, if you succeed in claiming this relic, the responsibility for how it's used will rest on your conscience for all eternity. As the sun reached its zenith, the Crimson Serpent weighed anchor and began its journey into the Devil's Triangle. The crew worked with nervous efficiency, checking and rechecking their equipment while Beatrice stood at the bow, her golden hair streaming in the wind like a banner of hope against the gathering storm clouds. Callum joined her there, watching the waters grow darker and more ominous with each passing mile. Are you certain about the location? He asked. Beatrice nodded, her eyes reflecting depths that seemed to echo the ocean itself. The pull of the relic grows stronger as we approach. I can feel it calling to the curse in my blood, recognizing. She turned to meet his gaze. There's something else you should know, Callum. If we succeed in retrieving the relic, breaking the curse will require a willing sacrifice from someone who married into the bloodline. The implications of her words hit him like a cold wave. I mean that saving me might cost you your life, she said quietly. The curse must be transferred to someone else or destroyed entirely through the willing death of a Blackwood spouse. I should have told you before, but I was afraid you would change your mind. Callum was quiet for a long moment, watching the dolphins that raced alongside their ship as though trying to warn them away from their destination. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. I've spent my life taking things that didn't belong to me, caring only for my own profit and pleasure. Maybe it's time I gave something back. If my death can free you from this curse, then it's a trade I'm willing to make. Beatrice stared at him with an expression of wonder and gratitude that transformed her features completely. For the first time since their bizarre wedding, Callum saw not a monster or a stranger, but a woman who had carried an impossible burden with grace and courage that humbled his own selfish concerns. The storm clouds above them began to spiral in patterns that defied natural weather systems, and the water beneath their keel took on an unsettling greenish hue that spoke of supernatural forces at work. They were entering the Devil's Triangle, and there would be no turning back. The Devil's Triangle greeted them with waters that seemed to whisper secrets in languages older than civilization itself. As the Crimson Serpent sailed deeper into the cursed region, the crew noticed disturbing changes in their surroundings. Fish swam in perfect spirals beneath the surface, their scales glowing with phosphorescent light. The wind carried sounds that might have been voices calling from impossible distances, and the compass spun wildly before settling on directions that pointed to nowhere on any earthly map. Beatrice stood at the bow like a figurehead carved from living marble, her golden hair whipping around her face as she guided them toward their destination. The gold fragment in her possession had begun to hum with increasing intensity, its supernatural vibrations resonating through the ship's timbers, until even the most skeptical crew members could feel its power thrumming in their bones. There, she said suddenly, pointing toward a patch of water that looked identical to every other patch they had sailed through. The entrance lies directly below us. Callum studied the seemingly empty ocean, searching for any sign of the underwater caves Beatrice had described. The water was deeper here, taking on an almost black quality that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Occasionally, shadows moved in the depths, shapes too large and too purposeful to be mere fish. Drop anchor, he commanded, and his crew moved with practiced efficiency. The anchor chain rattled down into the abyss, its links disappearing into darkness that seemed hungry for anything brave enough to descend. Father Miguel had spent the journey blessing their makeshift diving equipment with holy water and muttered prayers in Latin. Weighted nets would carry them down quickly, while lengths of blessed rope would serve as their lifeline to the surface. Iron harpoons gleamed with sacred oils, and each man wore a crucifix, dipped in water from the Jordan River. "The tide is at its lowest," Beatrice announced, consulting an ornate timepiece that had belonged to her great-grandmother. "We have perhaps 2 hours before the currents shift and make descent impossible." Callum was the first to go over the side, weighted net dragging him down through water that grew colder and darker with each fathom. The pressure built in his ears until they popped painfully, and his lungs burned with the effort of holding his breath. Around him his crew descended like falling angels, their faces pale ovals in the supernatural gloom. At 40 feet, they encountered the first guardian. It had once been a Spanish soldier. That much was clear from the remnants of conquistador armor that had fused with its transformed flesh. But centuries underwater had changed it into something that belonged more to nightmare than to any earthly sea. Gills fluttered along its elongated neck, while webbed claws had replaced human hands. Its eyes glowed with phosphorescent light, and when it opened its mouth to roar a challenge, rows of shark-like teeth gleamed in the darkness. Briggs was closest to the creature, and his blessed harpoon found its mark with deadly accuracy. The guardian writhed in apparent agony as the holy iron pierced its transformed flesh, but instead of dying, it began to multiply. Where its ichor touched the water, new guardians spawned, smaller versions of the original, but no less deadly. At 60 feet they found the cave entrance. It yawned before them like the mouth of some primordial beast, its edges lined with formations that looked disturbingly like teeth. Phosphorescent algae provided just enough light to reveal a tunnel that stretched beyond the reach of human vision, disappearing into depths that might lead to the very center of the earth. The tunnel branched and twisted like a maze designed by madmen, but Beatrice's gold fragment provided guidance. It pulsed brighter when they chose the correct path, dimmer when they went astray. After what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, they emerged into a vast underwater cathedral carved from living rock. The chamber was filled with air that shimmered like heated metal, allowing them to breathe while still being 60 feet below the ocean's surface. Pillars of coral and crystallized bone supported a ceiling that sparkled with embedded gems. But it was the chamber's center that drew their attention like a magnet draws iron filings. On a dais of black volcanic glass sat La Corona del Océano, the crown of the ocean. It was carved from what appeared to be a single massive pearl that glowed with its own inner fire. Symbols covered every surface, writhing and shifting as though alive, speaking of power over wind and wave, storm and calm. But the crown was not unguarded. Don Carlos Monteverde sat upon it still, or what remained of him after 3 centuries of supernatural preservation. His Spanish nobleman's clothing had rotted away, revealing flesh that had taken on the texture of coral and barnacles. His eyes were pools of phosphorescent light, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "So," he said in Spanish-accented English, "another generation of Blackwood women comes seeking to undo what was rightfully earned. Tell me, descendant of my beloved Isabella, do you truly understand what breaking this curse will cost?" Beatrice stepped forward, water dripping from her cloak as she faced the ancient nobleman. "I understand that my great-grandmother stole from you, and that your revenge has punished the innocent along with the guilty. I seek only to end the cycle." Don Carlos laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber like breaking glass. The curse was designed to ensure that Blackwood women would never again use their feminine wiles to steal what belonged to others. "Then accept that the debt has been paid," Callum interjected, stepping protectively in front of Beatrice. 3 generations of women have suffered for one woman's crime. Enough blood has been spilled to satisfy any concept of justice. The Spanish nobleman's glowing eyes fixed on Callum with predatory interest. "Ah, the husband. Tell me, pirate, what did you know of your bride when you wed her? Did you marry for love, or for a barrel of rum?" Callum felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he met Don Carlos's gaze steadily. "I married for rum, I'll admit, but I'm here for her." "How touching," Don Carlos sneered. "And are you prepared to take her place? For that is what breaking the curse requires, a willing soul to bear the burden or the complete destruction of the relic." The choice hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Callum looked at the crown, at the power it represented, then at Beatrice, really looked at her, and saw not the monster she became each month, but the woman who had borne an impossible burden with grace and dignity he could never match. "I choose her," he said simply, stepping toward the dais. "Take the curse and give it to me. Let her be free." But as he reached for the crown, Beatrice caught his arm with surprising strength. "No," she said firmly. "There's another way. The curse can be broken by destroying the relic entirely, but it requires someone of Blackwood blood to make the sacrifice." She pulled the gold fragment from her cloak and held it high, speaking words in the ancient language that had created the curse. The fragment began to resonate with the larger crown, their combined vibration growing stronger until the very walls of the chamber began to crack. Don Carlos rose from his throne in alarm. "What are you doing, foolish girl? Destroying the crown will collapse the entire cave system. You'll kill us all." "Some prices are worth paying," Beatrice replied, and for the first time since Callum had met her, she smiled with genuine happiness. "Callum, get your crew out of here, now." The chamber shook as the resonance between fragment and crown reached a crescendo. Cracks appeared in the volcanic glass dais, spreading outward like a spider's web. The phosphorescent light that had illuminated the underwater cathedral began to flicker and fade. Callum's crew needed no further encouragement. They dove for the tunnel entrance as the ceiling began to rain debris, but Callum himself hesitated, unwilling to abandon the woman who had shown him what real courage looked like. "Go," Beatrice shouted over the increasing roar of collapsing stone. "Live the life I never could." The last thing Callum saw before the tunnel sealed behind him was Beatrice standing on the crumbling dais, her arms raised in triumph as the cursed crown shattered into 1,000 pieces of lightless glass. The sacrifice of someone willing to choose others' freedom over her own power had finally broken the cycle of vengeance that had consumed the Blackwood women for 3 generations. They surfaced to find the triangle's waters returning to normal, the unnatural green glow fading as the curse's hold on the region finally broke. The storm clouds dispersed, revealing stars that shone with honest light. Callum never married again, but he kept the gold fragment that had washed up on Tortugas Beach 3 days later, the only remaining piece of La Corona del Océano. He used its small power not for conquest, but to guide lost ships safely to harbor and to calm storms that threatened innocent sailors. Sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark and the wind carried whispers from distant waters, he thought he could hear Beatrice's voice in the waves, not crying as she had in the dungeon, but laughing with the joy of someone finally, eternally free.